Close your eyes for a moment and picture Naples in the early 1980s. The air was heavy with smoke from small cafes, with the scent of strong coffee drifting through narrow streets. Laundry swayed above alleyways like forgotten flags, and voices echoed off stone walls, carrying the rhythm of a city that had long danced between beauty and violence. Naples was no stranger to unrest. Its history was carved with poverty and rebellion, but in 1981, the city stood on the edge of something different. A new kind of power was rising, not through the thunder of machine guns on the streets, but from the pen of a man locked away in a cold, dim prison cell to the north. His name was Raffaele Cutolo. Among his followers and enemies alike, he carried a curious title. Professor? The Professor. Cutolo wasn't like the gangsters you see in movies, who shout orders and flash their wealth in crowded clubs. He ruled in silence, in stillness, with a gaze that unnerved even the toughest men. But what made him truly different was this. While others spread fear with knives and bullets, he reached for paper and ink. He wrote poems, letters, and verses that carried more weight than pistols. His words became commands, and his poetry became law. To understand Cutolo's rise, you must understand Naples. In those years, it was a city caught between survival and chaos. Unemployment was crushing. Corruption was woven into daily life, and the Camorra, the Neapolitan Mafia, was splintered and violent. The old clans ruled with fractured loyalties, each family fighting for scraps of power. People lived in fear, caught between rival bosses, corrupt officials, and the grinding poverty of the streets. It was in this storm that Cutolo offered something unexpected. He gave order. He gave meaning. He offered his followers not just a place in a criminal empire, but a story, a belief that they were part of something bigger, something almost sacred. He called it the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, the new organized Camorra. And through it, he promised both loyalty and destiny. But in 1981, when our story begins, Cutolo wasn't walking free through Naples. He was serving time inside a prison north of the city. For most men, a prison cell is a cage, a place where power dies. But for Cutolo, prison became a throne. His influence flowed through letters smuggled out by loyalists, through poems that doubled as orders, through coded messages hidden in verse. The paradox was stark: a man behind bars who commanded more power than the bosses roaming the streets. He was in many ways a contradiction. He quoted Dante and Petrarch in courtrooms, baffling judges with references to Italian literature. He would sit in silence, waiting for others to speak first, and in that silence he seemed untouchable, as though the world moved according to his rhythm. His words were sharp but calm, and when he spoke, even his enemies leaned closer, unable to look away. This wasn't the gangster of American cinema, the loud, brash figure who demanded attention. No, Cutolo's strength lay in the opposite. He didn't chase the spotlight, but he didn't hide from it either. Instead, he reshaped it. He presented himself not as a thug, but as a thinker, not as a brute, but as a poet. And that image, carefully cultivated, gave him a different kind of power, the power of belief. His followers believed in him with almost religious devotion. They called him Professore because he taught them more than crime. He taught them rituals, discipline, and meaning. Each recruit wasn't just another soldier. He was a member of a story, a character in a saga that stretched beyond prison walls and into legend. And so, as Naples swirled with tension in 1981, whispers of Cutolo's empire grew louder. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata was expanding, uniting scattered factions under his command. Old bosses were being pushed aside, their power eroded not by brute force alone, but by the strange magnetism of a man who ruled with poetry. Imagine it in a damp prison cell. Cutolo bent over sheets of paper, the scratching of his pen echoing against stone walls. Outside, guards paced the corridors, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit that within those pages lay orders that could shift the balance of power in Naples. Poems turned into decrees. Verses became law. A word from Cutolo could decide who lived and who died, who rose and who fell, all from behind bars. But this was not chaos. It wasn't wild. It was ritualized, structured, like a religion of crime. Cutolo believed in symbols, gestures, oaths, the power of stories. He built his empire on meaning, on the human hunger for belonging. And in a city drowning in uncertainty, meaning was more powerful than any weapon. Naples in 1981 was haunted by his presence. Politicians feared him, rival bosses plotted against him, and yet, in the alleys and prisons, his legend only grew. He was the man who could command an army without raising his voice, the man who merged blood with verse, the poet king of the Camorra. This is where our journey begins, not in the chaos of the streets, but in the quiet of a cell, not with the noise of gunfire, but with the whisper of a pen. Close your eyes and listen carefully. This is not the story of a gangster in the ordinary sense. This is the story of Raffaele Cutolo, a man who turned silence into power, who transformed prison into a palace, who wrote his empire in ink and shadow. And in 1981, his story was only just beginning. Before the legend of old Professore was born, there was simply Raffaele Cutolo, a boy from Ottaviano, a small town at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. Naples lay just beyond, with its crowded streets and restless heart, but Ottaviano had its own shadows. It was a place where tradition weighed heavily, where poverty marked lives before they even began, and where survival often depended on one's ability to navigate the silent rules of the underworld. Raffaele was born in 1941 in a world still scarred by war. The Second World War had left southern Italy battered and poor. Families struggled to feed themselves. The promise of opportunity was scarce. For many, the only real currency was respect, and respect was earned or taken through strength. As a child, Raffaele was restless, clever, and proud. He didn't fade into the background like so many others. He wanted more. He wanted to be seen, to be respected. But unlike other young men who carved their names into Naples with fists or knives, he had something different, a quiet intensity, a presence that made others pause before speaking. By his teenage years, that presence became dangerous. He was hot-tempered, unwilling to be humiliated, unwilling to step aside. In Naples, a man's reputation could be destroyed in an instant, and Raffaele knew it. One evening in the 1950s, during a fight sparked by an insult to his sister, Cutolo struck back with lethal force. The killing marked the end of his youth and the beginning of his destiny. Prison came quickly, but rather than break him, it transformed him. Where others were diminished by confinement, Cutolo grew. Behind the stone walls, he absorbed the codes of the Camorra. He learned its rituals, its traditions, its unwritten laws. But he also observed its weaknesses. The old Camorra clans were divided, fragmented, and often more concerned with internal feuds than true power. In prison, Cutolo began to imagine something different. Not just a gang, not just a collection of families clawing at scraps, but an organization. A new Camorra united under structure and ritual, bound by loyalty not just to money but to meaning. It was in those years of confinement that the idea of the Nuova Camorra Organizzata began to take shape. But the transformation of Raffaele Cutolo into Professore was not built only on strategy. It was also built on image. He cultivated an aura that set him apart from ordinary criminals. While others shouted, he stayed calm. While others scrawled crude words, he wrote poems, he quoted literature. He carried himself as if he were not merely a gangster, but a thinker, a man above the common fray. This duality fascinated people. Guards, inmates, politicians, even journalists found themselves unsettled by him. Here was a man who could order a killing with one breath and recite Dante in the next. A man who seemed to belong both to the underworld and to the world of ideas. He blurred the line between crime and philosophy, and in doing so, he became larger than life. The title Professor was not an accident, it was earned. Other prisoners began to look to him for guidance, not just on matters of survival, but on how to understand themselves within the brutal world they inhabited. He spoke of honor, of brotherhood, of destiny. He gave them not just orders, but stories. Stories in which they were not simply criminals, but chosen men in a greater narrative. It was intoxicating. Men who had nothing suddenly felt like they belonged to something eternal. They swore loyalty not just out of fear, but out of belief. That was Cutolo's true genius, not violence, not money, but belief. And so, slowly, his legend grew. Even outside the prison walls, whispers spread of the man who commanded without shouting. The man who wrote verses that carried more weight than decrees from old bosses. Naples began to know his name, and among those who sought power, many began to choose him as their compass. The late 1970s set the stage for what would come. The old Camorra was weakening, unable to stand against the tide of change. Cutolo's vision offered something new, something more disciplined. And as the 1980s began, his Nuova Camorra Organizzata became not just an idea, but a force. Yet to understand why men followed him, you must return again to that prison cell. Imagine it, the walls stained with time, the air damp and heavy. A narrow bed, a small desk, and sheets of paper scattered with ink. Outside the bars, guards walked with keys clanging at their sides. But inside, Raffaele sat still writing as though the pen itself were his weapon, his kingdom, his crown. Prison had taken his freedom, but it had given him something greater: control. In the stillness, in the silence, he forged himself into O Professore, and from that identity flowed everything that would follow. The empire, the legend, the fear, the loyalty. By 1981, Naples was no longer a city of fragmented clans. It was a city where one man, locked behind bars, could bend the will of thousands. A man whose words carried more force than bullets. A man who had turned himself into a symbol. The making of O Professore was complete, and Naples would never be the same. Prisons are meant to contain. They are built with high walls and locked gates, with guards who believe iron bars can hold back ambition. But for Raffaele Cutolo, prison was never a barrier. It was a crucible, a place where his ideas burned brighter than the sun outside. Within those walls, he began to shape what would become one of the most powerful and feared organizations in Naples, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, or NCO. The old Camorra was fractured, bound loosely by blood and neighborhood allegiances. Its clans fought among themselves, more concerned with short-term gains than lasting order. Cutolo saw opportunity in their weakness. He saw the hunger in the eyes of young men, lost, unemployed, desperate, and he offered them something no one else could: a structure, a brotherhood, and a purpose. He built his organization not on chaos, but on ritual. Every recruit went through a ceremony. They were not simply welcomed, they were reborn. Oaths were taken, sacred promises sworn, and in those rituals, men found a new identity. They were no longer forgotten youths from Naples' poorest quarters. They became soldiers of the NCO, part of a legacy larger than themselves. Cutolo knew the power of symbols. He drew from tradition, from religion, even from myth. Candles, prayers, coded language, all became part of the initiation. For men who had grown up in poverty, stripped of dignity, these ceremonies gave them pride. They were not joining a gang. They were joining a brotherhood, one that carried meaning in every gesture. But Cutolo went further. He did not demand blind obedience through fear alone. He gave his soldiers something more intoxicating belief. He told them they were chosen. He told them they were building a new world. He told them they were different from the petty criminals who wandered the streets. And because he spoke with calm conviction, they believed him. From his cell, Cutolo issued instructions. Letters smuggled past guards carried his words. Loyal intermediaries whispered his orders in the ears of men across Naples. And soon, his influence reached beyond prison walls into neighborhoods where the NCO became the dominant force. The genius of his method was that it worked in layers. On the surface, the NCO looked like any other mafia clan. It controlled extortion, gambling, drugs, and contracts. But beneath that surface was something more, a carefully built hierarchy, bound together not only by money, but by loyalty and ritual. At the top was a Professore, whose word was absolute. Beneath him were trusted lieutenants, who ensured his will spread like scripture. And beneath them, hundreds of recruits who enforced his law in the streets. In this way, Cutolo's NCO grew with astonishing speed. Naples, with its poverty and restless youth, became fertile ground. The unemployed found purpose in the organization. The desperate found power. Even those who had once feared the Camorra found comfort in the order Cutolo provided. He was not just building a mafia. He was building a system. By the early 1980s, his reach extended into politics, business, and even the prison system itself. Guards, intimidated or corrupted, looked the other way as his influence spread. Politicians, desperate for control in a volatile city, sometimes turned to him for favors. And prisoners, those forgotten men society had cast aside, became his most loyal followers. Still, what set the NCO apart was not only its size, but its philosophy. For Cutolo, power without meaning was fragile, so he layered his empire with stories. Every soldier felt part of a myth, every act of violence framed as part of a greater struggle. It was not extortion, it was justice, it was not crime, it was destiny. And the man at the center of it all, the one writing poems and verses in a dim cell, was more than a boss. He was a prophet. His followers called him "O Professore" with reverence, as if he were teaching them not only how to live, but how to believe. But with growth came conflict. The old clans of the Camorra, rooted in Naples for generations, did not accept this new order quietly. To them, Cutolo was a dangerous dreamer, a man rewriting rules that had stood for decades. Rivalries turned bloody, streets echoed with gunfire, and yet, even as bullets flew, Cutolo remained untouched in his cell, his authority intact, his legend only deepening. He never raised his voice. He never appeared frantic. To his followers, his calmness in the face of violence was proof of his destiny. They saw him as untouchable, a man guided by fate, a leader who could command an army without lifting a finger. By 1981, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata was no longer just an idea whispered in prison corridors. It was a force that ruled the streets of Naples. Its soldiers collected money, enforced loyalty, and silenced opposition. Its structure rivaled that of the state itself, and its leader, sitting quietly in a prison cell, was shaping history with every word he wrote. Imagine the paradox outside. Men died in the streets. Battles raged between clans, and yet inside his cell, Cutolo wrote poetry. He quoted Dante, recited verses of love and death, and through those words, he built an empire. His followers clung to every syllable, as if the ink of his pen was blessed, as if the rhythm of his poetry carried the weight of law. It was this paradox, the merging of poetry and power, that made him unforgettable. He was not simply a gangster. He was something stranger, something more unsettling, a man who transformed crime into ritual, who turned belief into currency, who built a kingdom not on fear alone, but on meaning. And so the NCO grew, Naples changed, and the world began to take notice. Journalists wrote of the poet Gangster. Politicians whispered about his influence. Rivals plotted in fear. But no one could deny that a new kind of Camorra had been born, one that carried the handwriting of O Professore. This was the empire he dreamed of in silence. This was the organization forged not in the chaos of the streets, but in the stillness of a cell. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata was more than a mafia. It was a mirror of Cutolo himself, calm on the surface, but dangerous in its depth. And in 1981, it was only beginning to reveal its true power. By 1981, Naples was no longer a city divided into countless small clans, each fighting for survival. It was a battlefield, and at the center of that battlefield was one man, O Professore. From his prison cell, Raffaele Cutolo extended his reach like a spider spinning an invisible web, and soon no street corner, no cafe, no business in Naples was untouched by his hand. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata had grown with astonishing speed. Its ranks swelled with hundreds, even thousands of men. Recruits came from every corner of the city, unemployed youths with no future, petty criminals looking for purpose, and prisoners eager for protection. For each of them, the NCO offered a place in a larger story. They were no longer nameless faces in the crowd. They were soldiers in a sacred brotherhood. But power invites enemies. The old Camorra clans, men who had ruled Naples for generations, refused to kneel to Cutolo. They saw him as a usurper, a dangerous visionary who threatened everything they had built. For them, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata was not a renewal. It was a rebellion. And so began the Camorra Wars, some of the bloodiest years Naples had ever known. The streets became stages of violence. Cafes where men once sipped coffee turned into execution sites. Markets once buzzing with vendors echoed with gunfire. Cars exploded. Bodies appeared in alleyways. Each death was a message, each murder a line in the grim dialogue between the old and the new. Cutolo, though imprisoned, was untouched. From within the cold walls, he directed his army like a general in a distant fortress. Orders flowed out in coded letters, carried by loyal messengers. His lieutenants in Naples executed those commands with precision, ensuring that no one doubted the reach of old Professore. But what was most unsettling was his composure. While men died in the streets, while families mourned in silence, Cutolo remained calm, writing poems in the quiet of his cell. He seemed untethered from the violence, as though it were simply a necessary rhythm of the empire he was creating. His followers interpreted this calm as proof of destiny, that their leader was guided by something greater than mere ambition. The violence escalated. The old clans retaliated fiercely, refusing to be erased. Each side fought not only for money, but for survival, for honor, for the soul of Naples itself. And in the middle of this storm stood Cutolo, both present and absent, both imprisoned and free. Newspapers began to write of him with fascination and fear. Headlines spoke of the poet Gangster, the professor of the Camorra. Politicians whispered his name in hushed tones, recognizing that even from behind bars, his influence rivaled their own. Judges faced him in courtrooms, baffled as he quoted literature, instead of defending himself in plain words. And through it all, he grew more myth than man. The paradox of Cutolo's reign was impossible to ignore. He ruled not by shouting orders in the streets, but by creating a narrative his men believed in. The NCO was not just a criminal organization. It was a vision, a story that elevated petty criminals into soldiers of destiny. and that vision was powerful enough to send thousands into battle against the old Camorra. The war left deep scars on Naples. Ordinary people who had no part in the struggle lived in fear. Shopkeepers paid protection to whichever faction controlled their neighborhood that week. Families kept their children indoors at night, afraid of stray bullets. The line between life and death became thinner with every passing day, and yet, among his loyalists, Cutolo's reputation only grew. Each victory was celebrated as proof of his genius. Each survival through hardship was seen as destiny fulfilled. They believed in him with a devotion that bordered on worship, but while the streets ran with blood, Cutolo remained untouchable in his cell. Guards were either intimidated or bribed. Politicians were either cautious or complicit, and rivals found themselves hunted the moment they showed weakness. The empire of Professore seemed unstoppable. Still, every empire built on blood faces a cost. The more men he commanded, the more enemies he created, and the more the violence spread, the more the state itself began to take notice. Italy, already scarred by years of political terrorism and Mafia wars in Sicily, could no longer ignore the bloodshed in Naples. But for now, in 1981, the storm raged unchecked. The NCO stood at its height. The old clans fought with fury, and Naples was a city caught in the grip of a war where poetry and violence walked hand in hand. Picture the scene: the narrow alleys at night, lit by flickering lamps. Shadows move quickly, a shot echoes, and silence returns. Somewhere across the city, a family weeps. And in a prison cell, Raffaele Cutolo dips his pen into ink, writing verses that drift between beauty and menace, as if each word were another step in the unfolding war. This was the paradox of Professore. He built an empire with poetry, but maintained it with blood. And in the early 1980s, that empire seemed destined to last forever. But history has its own rhythm. Every rise carries within it the seeds of decline. And though Cutolo's power seemed limitless, forces were already gathering that would one day challenge even the poet king of the Camorra. For now, though Naples belonged to him, power comes in many forms. Some wield it through fear, raising their voices and brandishing weapons. Others wield it through wealth, buying loyalty one coin at a time. But for Raffaele Cutolo, power flowed from something far more subtle: belief. And the tools he used to forge that belief were not pistols or knives, but poetry, silence, and ritual. By 1981, the Nuova Camorra Organizzata was a vast network. Its soldiers filled the streets of Naples. Its rivals were either buried or hiding. Its name carried weight in prisons and neighborhoods alike. But what held it all together was not just violence. It was Cutolo's image, the myth of Professore. Inside his prison cell, he cultivated that myth with care. He understood that men do not follow brutality alone. They follow symbols, they follow stories. And so he gave them both. He wrote constantly, poems, letters, reflections. Some were tender, speaking of love or fate. Others carried hidden meanings, coded orders disguised in verse. To his followers, these writings were more than words. They were sacred texts, proof that their leader was not an ordinary man, but a figure touched by destiny. In court, when summoned before judges, he never behaved like a criminal begging for leniency. He stood calmly, quoting lines from Dante, Petrarch, or Boccaccio. He spoke softly, with the rhythm of a teacher, as though the trial were not his own, but a lecture in literature. Judges were baffled, reporters fascinated. Here was a man accused of commanding death, yet speaking in the voice of a scholar. That contradiction deepened his aura. To his enemies, it was unsettling. To his followers, it was inspiring. He was not merely a boss. He was a poet king. Silence was another of his weapons. In a world where gangsters often shouted to prove strength, Cutolo rarely raised his voice. He sat still, observing, letting silence fill the room until others grew uncomfortable. And when he finally spoke, the weight of his words seemed doubled by the quiet that had preceded them. His followers learned to revere that silence as if it were a ritual in itself. Ritual, too, was at the heart of his control. The NCO was structured around ceremonies that bound men together. New recruits swore loyalty in dimly lit rooms, surrounded by symbols that elevated crime into a sacred duty. Candles burned, oaths were spoken. Hands were cut to seal blood bonds. These were not mere theatrics. They were Cutolo's way of turning men into believers. In Naples, where poverty stripped people of dignity, these rituals restored a sense of purpose. A boy who once felt invisible could become part of a brotherhood that claimed to be eternal. And because Professore promised meaning, he inspired loyalty that bullets alone could never secure. Even within prison walls, his presence radiated. Other inmates, many forgotten by the world, found solace in his teachings. He offered them a sense of order in chaos, a structure in the void of their lives. For them, the prison was no longer a place of despair. It was a cathedral where Cutolo's words echoed like sermons. The outside world took notice. Journalists wrote of him with a mixture of awe and dread. They described a man who blurred the line between gangster and philosopher. Politicians whispered about him in Rome, troubled that a prisoner in Naples could wield more influence than elected officials. And the people of Naples themselves, wary of violence, could not ignore the strange magnetism of his name. What made him extraordinary was that his power was not just external, it was internal. He understood the theater of leadership. He crafted an identity that transcended the ordinary boundaries of crime. By presenting himself as a thinker, a man of letters, he lifted himself above his rivals. He became untouchable, not only because of his soldiers, but because of the myth he embodied. But myths, once created, take on lives of their own. Among his followers, stories of Professore spread like gospel. Some claimed he could predict outcomes before they happened. Others whispered that his calmness came from divine protection. He became more than a man. He became a legend, a figure whose existence seemed larger than reality itself. This was Cutolo's true genius, not just building an organization, but building a narrative. His enemies had guns. His rivals had money, but he had belief. And belief, in a city as restless as Naples, was more dangerous than any weapon. Still, belief could not exist without fear. For all the poetry, all the ritual, Cutolo's empire was not built on words alone. Violence remained its foundation. His followers knew that loyalty was sacred and betrayal unforgivable. Those who crossed him met quiet, certain ends. Their deaths were messages woven into the myth of inevitability that surrounded him. And so, Naples lived under two overlapping realities. By day, markets bustled. Children played in courtyards, life carried on. But beneath that surface lay the shadow of the NCO, where every shopkeeper, every cafe owner, every small-time criminal knew that Professore watched even from behind bars. The paradox was striking. A man who wrote love poems also wrote death sentences. A man who quoted Dante also commanded armies. A man who sat in silence also filled the streets with blood. But to his followers, this paradox only made him greater. He was not limited by ordinary rules. He was the poet king of Naples, a leader who could merge beauty with terror, ink with blood, silence with power. By the early 1980s, his myth was at its peak. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata stretched across the city like an invisible hand. Rivals trembled, politicians hesitated, and soldiers pledged their lives in loyalty. And in the quiet of his cell, Raffaele Cutolo continued to write, lines of poetry that blurred the boundary between art and command, between dream and empire. For him, the pen was not only mightier than the sword, it was the sword, and Naples for a time belonged entirely to the poet king. By the early 1980s, Raffaele Cutolo was no longer just a gangster in a cell. He had become something far more unsettling. A man whose influence reached beyond the prison gates, beyond Naples, and into the very heart of Italian politics. From the silence of his confinement, he was becoming a power broker. Italy in those years was a country trembling with crisis. Terrorist groups like the Red Brigades kidnapped politicians and businessmen. The Sicilian Mafia controlled international drug routes. The old Camorra families fought bitter wars in Naples. Corruption and fear touched every level of society. The government was desperate for control, desperate for solutions. And in their desperation, some turned to the unlikeliest of allies, old Professore. Cutolo's reputation had spread far beyond Naples. He was no longer seen only as a local boss. He was recognized as a man who commanded thousands, who could influence entire communities, who could bring order to chaos if he chose to. For politicians, this power was tempting. To reach him meant to reach the streets. To negotiate with him meant to negotiate with the underworld itself. One of the most striking examples came during the Cirillo kidnapping in 1981. Cirillo, a Christian Democrat politician, had been abducted by the Red Brigades, the same group that had murdered former Prime Minister Aldo Moro. Just 3 years earlier, the state had refused to negotiate for Moro, and he was executed. But for Cirillo, something different happened. Behind the scenes, a secret path was opened. Cutolo, from within his prison cell, became a mediator. Through his contacts, his network, and his influence in Naples, he helped arrange Cirillo's release. The details remain murky, clouded in secrecy and denial. But the fact is clear: the Italian state, at least in this case, leaned on the power of a man it also called a criminal. For Cutolo, it was a triumph, not just because he gained prestige, but because it proved what he had always claimed, that he was more than a gangster. He was a force of order, a man capable of solving problems the government itself could not, and his legend grew. The newspapers whispered of his involvement, though officials denied it. Among his followers, the story became proof of his greatness. Here was a Professore, the poet king of Naples, who could move not only the streets, but the state itself. His myth stretched further, carried on the breath of rumor and the ink of journalists. But the Cirillo affair was not an isolated moment. Cutolo's reach extended into construction contracts, political campaigns, even the prison system. Politicians sought his blessing in quiet exchanges. Businessmen paid for his protection. Guards and wardens, some willingly and some under duress, turned a blind eye to his movements inside prison. To understand the paradox, you must imagine the scene. Cutolo, seated in his dim cell, the air heavy with damp stone. He writes with calm precision, his pen scratching across paper. Around him, silence. And yet, beyond those walls, his words move armies, shift money, alter the course of lives. From that stillness, he bends the machinery of both crime and politics. His authority was not loud. It was steady. He rarely shouted. He rarely rushed. He embodied patience as though time itself served him. That composure unnerved his rivals and charmed his followers. And for politicians desperate for stability, it was a quality they could not ignore. But with this political reach came danger. For as his influence grew, so too did the attention of the state. Investigators began to realize that the line between crime and politics in Naples had blurred, and at the center of that blur was Cutolo. Judges and prosecutors, some brave enough to defy him, began building cases. Rival clans, threatened by his dominance, tightened their alliances, waiting for a chance to strike. Still, for a time, he seemed untouchable. To his followers, he was more than a leader. He was a savior. They spoke of him as if he carried divine favor. They believed his calmness came from destiny, that his silence was wisdom, that his poetry was prophecy. And when they heard that even politicians bent to his will, their faith deepened. Naples, already torn by poverty and violence, now lived in the shadow of a man who was both criminal and kingmaker. Businesses survived at his mercy. Families feared or revered his name. And in Rome, where the government debated the future of the country, whispers of Cutolo's influence unsettled even the most powerful men. It is here, in this overlap between the state and the underworld, that the myth of O Professore reached its most dangerous height. He was no longer simply the head of a criminal organization. He was a man shaping the balance of power in Italy itself. And yet, beneath the triumph, shadows gathered. Rivals conspired. Judges sharpened their focus. Politicians who once sought his aid grew wary of the cost of being tied to his name. The very attention that elevated him also laid the path toward his eventual downfall. But in 1981 and the years that followed, that downfall was still unseen. For now Raffaele Cutolo was at the height of his reach, seated in silence while his influence stretched into places no Camorrista before him had ever gone. Picture him in his cell, calm, collected, writing in neat lines, while beyond the prison walls, politicians and criminals alike wait for his word. That was the paradox of the prison politician. He was locked away, and yet freer than many men who walked the streets. He was branded a criminal, and yet courted by the state. He was feared, admired, hated, and followed, but never ignored. For a moment in history, the destiny of Naples, and even of Italy, bent under the quiet hand of O Professore. Every empire has a rhythm. It rises with energy, expands with confidence, and eventually, whether slowly or suddenly, begins to tremble under the weight of its own power. For Raffaele Cutolo, the early 1980s had been years of triumph. His Nuova Camorra Organizzata had stretched across Naples like a shadow. His influence touched politics, business, and even the government itself. He seemed untouchable, invincible, destined to rule forever. But invincibility is a dangerous illusion, and by the mid-1980s, the first cracks began to appear in the crown of the poet king. The Camorra Wars had drained Naples of peace. The bloodshed, relentless and merciless, scarred the city. Families buried their sons. Shopkeepers closed their doors earlier each night, afraid of stray bullets. Ordinary people, who once believed Cutolo's promise of order, began to see only chaos. His narrative of destiny and discipline was harder to believe when the streets ran red, and rivals were learning. The old clans, battered but not broken, began to regroup. They saw that to survive, they needed to unite against the common enemy Cutolo and his NCO. Alliances formed in the shadows. Families that had once fought one another shook hands in quiet rooms. Together, they gathered strength, waiting for the moment to strike. The state, too, grew less willing to tolerate the poet king. Judges and prosecutors, many already battling the Sicilian Mafia, turned their attention to Naples. The violence could no longer be dismissed as local feuds. It had become a national crisis. Anti-Mafia units were expanded. Investigations deepened. Politicians who had once whispered with Cutolo began to distance themselves, unwilling to be caught in the same net. Inside prison, Cutolo remained calm. To his followers, his composure was a sign of strength. But behind that calmness, the world outside was shifting. The NCO, once united by belief, began to fracture under pressure. Loyalty is strong when victory feels certain, but when defeats mount, cracks begin to show. Some lieutenants, once fiercely devoted, saw opportunities in betrayal. Some sought to join with the rivals now gathering power. Others simply grew tired of endless bloodshed. The myth of Professore depended on inevitability, the sense that his rise was destiny. But when destiny falters, myths unravel. Whispers spread that the poet king was not as untouchable as he seemed. And in the shadows of Naples, those whispers grew louder. The rival clans struck with renewed force. Ambushes, assassinations, bombings, the war intensified. The NCO, stretched thin and bleeding men, could not keep pace. Cutolo's followers still revered him, but reverence could not replace the soldiers who were lost in the streets. The empire he had built with ink and ritual began to erode piece by piece. And yet, even as his grip weakened, his image endured. He still sat in courtrooms quoting poetry, still wrote verses in his cell that his men treated as law. But the weight of reality pressed against the myth. The silence that once inspired reverence began to feel like distance. The poetry that once carried command began to sound like memory. For the first time, Naples began to imagine a future beyond Professore. The state tightened its hold. New laws gave prosecutors greater power to pursue Mafia bosses. Prison regimes grew stricter, designed to sever communication between inmates and their networks outside. Wiretaps, surveillance, and arrests struck at the NCO's infrastructure. Cutolo's ability to rule from within the walls grew harder, his letters more closely monitored, his influence more carefully contained. Still, he resisted. He wrote, he whispered, he plotted. He believed, as he always had, that symbols and rituals were stronger than iron bars. But symbols alone could not stop bullets. Rituals could not erase betrayals, and poetry could not hold together an empire cracking under the weight of war. The decline was not sudden. It was slow, uneven, like the dimming of a candle whose flame flickers against the wind. Victories still came, but fewer. Losses grew heavier. Rivals, once frightened, now grew bolder. And within the ranks of the NCO, the faith that had once seemed unshakable began to tremble, even in decline. Though Cutolo's legend did not disappear. To his loyalists, he remained Professore, the man who had turned prison into a throne, who had made poetry a weapon. They clung to his image, even as the empire shrank. But the city itself, weary of war, no longer looked to him as a savior. Instead, many saw only another source of suffering, another king whose crown was paid for in blood. By the late 1980s, the cracks in the crown were too deep to ignore. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata, once feared as unstoppable, was fragmenting. Its leader, still seated in a cell, watched as the empire he had dreamed into existence slowly slipped from his grasp. And yet, through it all, he remained calm. He did not shout. He did not rage. He wrote, he reflected, he sat in silence, as though even decline was part of the story he had always meant to tell. Perhaps that was his greatest paradox of all, even as power slipped away. His legend endured, for in Naples, memory often weighs heavier than fact. And the memory of Professore, the poet king who built an empire of ink and blood, was not so easily erased. The crown cracked, but the myth remained. By the late 1980s, the empire of Raffaele Cutolo had faded into something smaller, something quieter. Once, the streets of Naples had trembled at the whisper of his name. Once, his Nuova Camorra Organizzata had felt unstoppable, a machine of loyalty and blood that spread from prisons to neighborhoods, from villages to the halls of power in Rome. But time is merciless. The wars had cost him too much. The rivals he had underestimated joined forces. The state at last recognized the scale of his influence and struck with sharpened determination. Slowly, deliberately, the world closed in around the poet king. For Cutolo, life in prison changed. The cell remained the same, stone walls, a narrow bed, a table for writing, but the silence grew heavier. The special prison regimes designed for Mafia leaders tightened their grip. Letters were monitored more closely. Visits were limited. Communications with the outside world, once his lifeline, were interrupted. Where once a note could move armies, now it often went nowhere at all. Isolation was the state's weapon, and it was effective. Cutolo had always believed his mind was stronger than walls, that his words could reach beyond bars. That belief alone could carry his power into the world. But as the 1980s turned to the 1990s, he discovered the limits of that faith. Inside the NCO, betrayal spread like a slow fire. The men who had once sworn loyalty began to drift. Some surrendered to the rival clans. Some cut deals with the state. Others simply abandoned the cause, choosing survival over honor. The rituals he had built, the brotherhood he had imagined, began to unravel. He heard of these betrayals through fragments. An intercepted letter, a whispered report, a headline in a smuggled newspaper. Each one chipped away at the empire he had built. Yet still, he remained composed. He did not beg. He did not collapse. To his followers, even in decline, he was a figure of dignity, a man who accepted fate with the same calmness that had once made him king. But isolation is a cruel companion. Day after day, Cutolo faced the silence of his cell. The poems he wrote no longer reached as many ears. The power they once carried was fading, like ink left too long in the sun. For the first time, he was no longer shaping history. He was only remembering it. Outside, Naples changed. A new generation of Camorra bosses rose, ruthless and pragmatic, less interested in poetry and symbols, more concerned with cocaine shipments and fast profits. They saw Cutolo as a relic, a figure of the past, a man whose era was over. The streets still remembered his name, but the fear it carried was weaker now, softened by time and by the violence of others. The state, meanwhile, pressed harder. Judges who had grown up in the shadow of terror were determined to break the Mafia's grip. Trials multiplied. Confiscations of property, stricter prison regimes, and the rise of pentiti, mafiosi who turned state's witness, struck at the heart of organized crime. Cutolo himself, once the architect of loyalty, now faced betrayal from those he had trusted most. Each testimony against him was another stone placed on the wall of his isolation. The courtroom, once his stage for reciting verses and displaying his intellect, became a place where former allies spoke against him, their words dismantling the myth piece by piece. And yet, through all of it, he continued to write. Poems, reflections, fragments of philosophy. His pen scratched against paper in the silence of the night, even when no one was listening. For Cutolo, words were not only weapons, they were survival. If the empire was gone, if the rituals had crumbled, if the crown had cracked, then the words remained. They were his only freedom, his only way to outlast the walls. His family, too, felt the weight of his decline. His sister, Rosetta, once his closest ally, continued to support him, to act as his voice in the world outside. But she, too, grew weary under the endless burden. The state watched her closely. Rivals threatened her. The strain of being tied to the poet king was unrelenting. Cutolo aged. The sharpness of youth gave way to the heaviness of years. His hair grayed. His health weakened. He was no longer the fiery figure who had turned a prison into a throne. Now he was a man who carried history inside him, a history that fewer and fewer wanted to remember, and yet even in decline, he remained a paradox. To some, he was still a legend, the man who had once ruled Naples from a cell, who had made poetry and power indistinguishable. To others, he was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest gangster could be caged, forgotten, reduced to silence. In the end, His greatest enemy was not the rivals who had united against him, nor the prosecutors who built cases, nor even the betrayal of his own men. His greatest enemy was time. Time eroded the myth, dimmed the memory, and left him in a cell where silence pressed harder than iron. But if you listened closely, if you placed your ear against the cold stone of Poggioriale or Ascoli, you might still hear the scratching of his pen, slow and steady as he wrote into the night. The empire was gone, but the words endured. And in those words, he remained a professor, the poet king, alone but unbroken, writing his story even as the world outside moved on without him. This was the long isolation of Raffaele Cutolo, not the roar of downfall, but the slow, quiet fading of a man who once commanded an empire with a verse. By the 1990s, Raffaele Cutolo was no longer a man at the center of power. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata had splintered, weakened by war, betrayal, and the relentless pressure of the state. Naples had moved on to new bosses, new clans, new wars. The poet king who once shaped the destiny of a city now lived in the shadow of his past. Yet, even in that shadow, he remained a figure who could not be ignored. For decades, he would linger in prison, watched, remembered, and sometimes forgotten, yet never fully erased. Cutolo aged within the walls. His hair turned white. His body, once filled with the restless energy of command, began to fail him. The long years of confinement weighed heavily. Prisons are not built for comfort, and his was a life measured by the narrow rhythm of locked doors, of small courtyards, of hours spent in silence. But still, he wrote. The pen remained his last weapon, his last claim to freedom. Poems, reflections, fragments of memory, all filled his notebooks. To some, they were evidence of a man who never surrendered his intellect. To others, they were the ramblings of someone trying to hold on to a world that had slipped away. Occasionally, his name would return to the newspapers. Journalists, fascinated by his paradox, would revisit the story of the man who had ruled Naples from a cell, the man who quoted poetry in court, the man who had helped negotiate a kidnapping while imprisoned. Each time, his legend was retold, reshaped, reimagined. He was never truly absent, even when his power had long disappeared. For the Italian state, he remained a symbol, a reminder of how dangerous one man could be if left unchecked. Even in old age, even with fading health, he was kept under strict regimes, denied the comforts of leniency. To the government, he was not only a prisoner, but a precedent. If he could build an empire from behind bars, so could another. He had to remain isolated, controlled, watched. To his followers, those few who still believed, he was a martyr of sorts. They saw him as a man betrayed by history, abandoned by those who had once worshipped him, yet still standing firm. They whispered of his dignity, his silence, his endurance. The empire was gone, but the aura of old Professore remained. His sister Rosetta continued to play a role in his life. Fiercely loyal, she supported him through the years, her own life marked by the burden of his legacy. But the weight of carrying the name Cutolo was heavy, and the years were not kind to her either. Their bond, however, endured until the end, a reminder that even the most isolated man is not entirely alone. Time in prison is slow, but decades turn quickly. The 2000s arrived. Naples had changed again. Entire generations had grown up since Cutolo's reign. Children who knew his name only through stories told by their parents and grandparents. To them, he was already a figure of legend, half real, half myth, like a character from a tale told at night. But myths can cut two ways. Some remembered him as a dark king, the man who bathed the city in blood for his own vision of order. Others remembered him as a figure of fascination, a man who blended poetry with power, intellect with intimidation. Few remembered him as simply human, In courtrooms, his presence grew weaker. No longer the commanding figure who recited verses with sharp eyes, he became an older man whose voice was softer, whose body was frailer. Yet, even then, there was an aura around him. Journalists wrote that when he entered, silence followed. Even diminished, he carried the weight of his past. The state refused his repeated requests for release on medical grounds. Each plea was denied. The reasoning was always the same. Raffaele Cutolo was too dangerous, too symbolic, too significant to ever be allowed outside prison walls. He would live and die in confinement, and so the fading flame burned behind bars. For years he moved between prisons, from Poggioreale to Ascoli, from one stone cell to another. The walls changed, but the rhythm did not. Each day was measured by the same routines, the same restrictions, the same silence. Only his writing and his memories traveled freely. It is said that in his final decades, he grew more reflective, less concerned with power, more occupied with meaning. He had always been fascinated by symbols, by rituals, by the weight of words. Now, those symbols were no longer tools of empire, but companions in solitude. He looked back at the choices he had made, the wars he had started, the lives lost under his command. Whether he felt remorse or only recognition is uncertain. But his poems often carried the tone of a man looking backward, searching for sense in the wreckage of his own history. The flame of power had dimmed. The flame of influence had weakened. But the flame of memory remained. Because in Naples, people still spoke of him. In cafes, in alleyways, in whispered conversations, his name lingered. Not with the same fear as before, but with fascination. He had become part of the city's story, inseparable from its modern history. To speak of Naples in the late 20th century was to speak of Professore. And so, as the years passed and his body failed, his myth lived on. The man faded, but the legend remained, a fading flame, still visible in the dark, still warming stories told in the night. For Raffaele Cutolo, the end of power was not the end of presence. He had become a ghost that Naples could not forget. Raffaele Cutolo lived longer than many of his soldiers, longer than many of his rivals, longer than most men who had chosen the path of blood and power. He outlived the Camorra Wars he started. He outlived the politicians who whispered with him. He even outlived the fear that once carried his name across Naples like a storm. But no man, not even a poet king, can outlive time itself. In 2021, at the age of 79, Raffaele Cutolo died in the prison hospital of Parma. It was not the violent end many had predicted. No assassin's bullet, no sudden betrayal in the dark. His end came quietly, in illness and age, after more than 6 decades behind bars. For a man who once commanded thousands, it was a small, almost invisible departure. Yet even in death, he stirred fascination. Newspapers across Italy carried the news. Headlines remembered him as the founder of the Nuova Camorra Organizzata, the man who ruled from prison, the gangster who wrote poetry. For a brief moment, his story returned to the surface of public memory, a ghost called back into the light. He left behind more than records and court files. He left behind an image, half feared, half romanticized, of a man who had tried to bind crime to culture, violence to verse. To some, he was still Professore, the intellectual boss, the mind that gave order to chaos. To others, he was nothing more than another criminal, responsible for bloodshed, suffering, and grief. But perhaps the truth was both. He was a paradox impossible to define in simple terms. A man who quoted poetry while commanding killers. A man who promised order but delivered war. A man who believed symbols could be stronger than bullets, yet built an empire that survived only through violence. For Naples, his death was not an end, but a closing of a chapter. The city had long since moved on to new struggles, new clans, new names. Yet his shadow remained, woven into the fabric of its history. In alleyways and piazzas, in whispers and in books, the story of who Professore lived on. Children who never saw him walk free still heard his name. Students who studied the Camorra read about his rituals, his codes, his strange marriage of poetry and power. And in the silence of the prison cell, he left behind, perhaps one can still imagine the sound that had filled it for decades. The scratch of a pen across paper, steady and unyielding. Words were his only freedom, and even after his death, they remain poems that outlived the empire, verses that survived the crown. His legacy is not simple. It is not the tale of a hero, nor entirely the tale of a villain. It is the story of a man who turned crime into theater, who gave the underworld its own literature, who blurred the line between myth and reality. When people speak of him now, they do so with mixed tones, some with fascination, some with bitterness, some with disbelief that one man could shape so much from inside a prison cell. But always there is recognition that, for better or worse, Raffaele Cutolo carved his name into the story of Naples, and so his life ends as it began, in paradox. Born into poverty, he created an empire. Imprisoned, he became powerful. Feared, he remained calm. Dying, he became eternal in memory. The last silence of old Professore is not the silence of defeat, nor the silence of triumph. It is the silence of history, the kind that lingers long after the man himself is gone, the kind that becomes a story told at night, in a steady rhythm as sleep draws near. This is why we remember him now in this story for sleep, not to glorify him, not to excuse him, but to see him as he was, a man who built an empire of words and blood, who dreamed of symbols stronger than fear, who ruled through belief, and who died in silence. And as we close this tale, let us leave him there, in the quiet of his final cell, pen resting on paper, his hand still for the first time, the poet king of the Camorra, the man they called, O Professore. Gone into the stillness he carried all his life. Now his words are all that remain, and in the rhythm of those words, in the echo of his paradox, we drift into sleep, carried not by fear, but by the strange, enduring story of a man who lived between poetry and power, silence and empire, life and legend.